Okay, so here's the thing. Most people think they already know the Bonnie and Clyde story. Young lovers, fast cars, smoky bank robberies, go down in a blaze of glory. Roll credits. Hollywood did such a good job packaging these two that the movie version basically replaced the real one in everybody's head. But if you actually sit down and look at what these two really did, day by day, road by road, it's a completely different story. Darker, messier, and honestly, way more tragic than any film ever bothered to show you. So that's what we're doing today. We're peeling back the whole romantic legend and looking at the actual people underneath. Two kids from dirt-poor Texas who made a series of choices that spiraled completely out of control. And trust me, by the time we're done, you're going to see Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow in a whole different light. If you're into real history, the kind they don't teach in school, make sure you subscribe to History Through Pictures. We do this stuff all the time, and you don't want to miss it. All right, let's go. Who were these people? Really first, let's talk about who Bonnie and Clyde actually were before everything went sideways. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born in 1910 in Rowena, Texas, second of three kids. Her dad, Charles Parker, was a bricklayer who died when she was only 4 years old. 4 years old. After that, her mum Emma packed up the kids and moved in with her own parents in a rough industrial neighbourhood in West Dallas called Cement City. Emma worked as a seamstress to keep everyone fed. Not exactly a glamorous upbringing. But here's the thing about Bonnie. She was sharp, like genuinely bright. Teachers noticed it. She won writing prizes. She loved being on stage, dreamed about becoming an actress, and she had this creative streak that never really went away. Even years later, when she was on the run, she was writing poetry, real poetry, not just scribbling. We'll come back to that. When she was 15, she met a guy named Roy Thornton. They dropped out of school together and got married on September 25th, 1926, just 6 days before her 16th birthday. And almost immediately, the marriage started falling apart. Roy was always in and out of legal trouble, always disappearing. By January 1929, they'd separated for good. But here's the weird part. They never actually divorced. When Bonnie died in 1934, she was still legally married to Roy Thornton, still wearing his ring. Roy, by the way, was in prison when he heard the news about her. His reaction? He basically said he was glad they went out the way they did, because at least they didn't get caught and rot in a cell, which tells you a lot about Roy. After the split, Bonnie moved back home with her mum and started waiting tables at a diner in Dallas. One of her regular customers was a postal worker named Ted Hinton. Now, you want to talk about a small world. That same Ted Hinton later became a sheriff's deputy, and he ended up being one of the 6 officers hiding in the bushes on a Louisiana highway in 1934. When everything ended. History is wild like that. Now Clyde Chestnut Barrow, and yes, that middle name is real, was born in 1909, and out near a tiny place called Tellico in Ellis County, Texas. 5th of 7 kids. His family were sharecroppers who were barely scraping by. In the early 1920s, like a lot of rural families chasing any kind of opportunity, the Barrows moved to Dallas. And we're not talking about a nice part of Dallas. They ended up in West Dallas, same rough neighbourhood as Bonnie. And when they first got there, they were so broke that they literally lived under their wagon. Until they could save up enough for a tent, Clyde's first real brush with the law came at 17. Got caught with a rental car he'd kept past the agreement, ran from the cops, got nabbed later with his brother Buck over some stolen turkeys. He held a few legit jobs between 1927 and 1929. But he was also breaking into safes, boosting cars, robbing small businesses. I'm a classic petty crime stuff. Then in January, 1930, he met Bonnie Parker, the first meeting and everything after. The way most historians tell it, Clyde showed up at his friend Clarence Clay's place on Herbert Street one afternoon. Bonnie happened to be there, helping a friend who'd broken her arm. Bonnie was in the kitchen making hot chocolate. They hit it off almost immediately, started spending all their time together. And then, about a month later, Clyde got arrested. Dallas County deputies picked him up on an auto theft charge. Bonnie secretly smuggled a gun into the jail. Clyde broke out. March 11th, 1930. Got recaptured a week later. By April, he was shipped to Huntsville State Prison. What happened to Clyde in prison is one of those parts of the story that gets glossed over in the Hollywood version. But it is genuinely important for understanding who he became. He was abused inside, seriously abused, including sexual abuse. At some point, he got into a confrontation with an inmate who'd been brutalizing him. That inmate died. Another prisoner already serving life took the blame, so Clyde wasn't formally charged. But something broke in him in there. His sister Marie said something must have happened to him in prison, because the person who came back was not the same person who went in. A fellow inmate named Ralph Fultz said he watched Clyde transform from a schoolboy into a rattlesnake. That is not a metaphor people use lightly. Clyde got so desperate to avoid the brutal labour on the prison farm that he had 2 of his own toes cut off, whether he did it himself or talked another inmate into doing it. Accounts differ, but either way, the man cut off his own toes to get out of field work. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. The cruel irony? His mother had already filed a petition for his early release. He was freed just 6 days after the amputation. If he had waited 1 week, he wouldn't have had to do it at all. He walked out of prison on February 2nd, 1932. And he was not the same person who went in. The Barrow gang takes shape. After his release, Clyde hooked back up with Ralph Fultz. The 2 of them started hitting small stores and gas stations. Not banks mostly, just whatever was accessible. Clyde's actual goal, according to historian John Neal Phillips, wasn't to get rich. It was to gather enough firepower to go back and attack the very prison that had broken him. That was the plan. And revenge on the system. Bonnie got pulled into it almost right away. In April 1932, she and Fultz were arrested trying to break into a hardware store in Kaufman, Texas. They were after guns. Bonnie was held for a few months, but the grand jury eventually declined to indict her, so she walked. While she was locked up in the Kaufman County Jail, Bonnie wrote poetry to pass the time, which again tells you something about her. Most people in that situation would be terrified or furious. She was writing poems. She got out, and within weeks she was back with Clyde, and from that point on, the Barrow gang really started racking up casualties. April 30th, 1932. A robbery in Hillsborough. Store owner J. N. Booker was killed. Clyde was the getaway driver, not the shooter. But Booker's wife identified him from a photograph. Then in August, out at a dance in Stringtown, Oklahoma, Clyde and a man named Raymond Hamilton got into it with a sheriff and his deputy, who approached them in the parking lot. The deputy, Eugene Moore, died. The sheriff was badly wounded. That was the first time a law officer died because of the Barrow gang. It would not be the last. By Christmas Eve, 1932, a 16-year-old kid from their neighborhood named W.D. Jones joined up with them. All 3 left Dallas together that night, the very next day, Christmas Day. Clyde and Jones killed a man named Doyle Johnson while trying to steal his car in Temple, Texas. Then in January, a deputy named Malcolm Davis walked into what turned out to be a law enforcement trap meant for someone else. But Bonnie, Clyde and Jones were there, and Davis ended up dead. Within 9 months of Clyde getting out of prison, 5 people were dead. Fame, photos, and the Joplin disaster. In March 1933, something shifted. Clyde's brother Buck got a full pardon from the governor of Texas and was released from prison. He and his wife Blanche came to visit Bonnie and Clyde at a rented apartment in Joplin, Missouri. According to Blanche later, the plan was just to visit, maybe try to talk Clyde into surrendering. They weren't planning to become part of the gang. But of course. That's not how it went. The group was loud and reckless. They stayed up late playing cards, drank heavily. Blanche said they went through a full case of beer every single day. The men were coming and going at weird hours. At one point, Clyde accidentally fired a Browning automatic rifle inside the apartment while he was cleaning it. Neighbours started noticing. On April 13, 1933, the Joplin police sent 5 officers to check the place out. They figured it was bootleggers. When the officers arrived, everything exploded. 2 officers were killed. Detective Harry McGinnis, Constable J.W. Harriman. The gang fought their way out. Bonnie was firing a bar to cover their escape. Blanche had been outside chasing her dog, Snowball, and they literally pulled her into the moving car off the street. But here's where it gets interesting. In their rush to escape, they left almost everything behind. And in that apartment, police found a camera with undeveloped film inside. When the Joplin Globe developed those photos, what they saw was remarkable. Good staged, playful poses. Bonnie with a cigar clamped between her teeth. Pistol aimed directly at the camera. Clyde with guns drawn, mugging for the lens like it was a movie set. W.D. Jones goofing around. There was also a poem Bonnie had written. All of it went out over the national wire services. Overnight. Bonnie and Clyde became household names. The public was fascinated. John Dillinger had movie star looks. Pretty Boy Floyd had a catchy nickname. But Bonnie and Clyde had something neither of them had. A couple. Young, dangerous, together against the world. The cigar photo especially took on a life of its own. People loved it. Bonnie hated it. She didn't actually smoke cigars, and she spent years annoyed that that was the image everyone remembered. On the run, really running after Joplin, and everything accelerated. Over the next few months, the gang ranged across the Midwest, Texas to Minnesota, and everywhere in between. They attempted a bank job in Lucerne, Indiana. They pulled off a robbery in Okabena, Minnesota. They kidnapped people in Ruston, Louisiana, taking a man named Dillard Darby and a woman named Sophia Stone along with Darby's car. But here's one of those strange, contradictory things about the Barrow gang. They almost always let their kidnapping victims go, not just release them. Sometimes they gave them money for the bus ride home. Darby and Stone were released unharmed. It made headlines almost as much as the robberies did. Meanwhile, life on the road was grinding them down. Blanche wrote about this period years later from prison, and what she described was nothing like the myth. Or the group was exhausted, paranoid, miserable. Their faces were all over the papers. They couldn't walk into a restaurant without risking recognition. They were sleeping outdoors, cooking over campfires, bathing in cold streams. 5 people crammed into one car almost every hour of every day, snapping at each other. Then, in June 1933, the car crash happened. Clyde was driving near Wellington, Texas, when he missed the warning signs for a bridge that was out. The car went off the road into a ravine. Bonnie was trapped and burned severely. Her right leg took the worst of it. 3rd-degree burns. Her leg contracted so badly she could never fully straighten it again. W.D. Jones said later that he genuinely didn't think she was going to survive. For weeks after that, Bonnie either had to hop on her good leg or be carried by Clyde. She never fully recovered. For the last year of her life, she was in constant pain. The Eastern Breakout and the beginning of the end, January 16, 1934. Clyde organised and pulled off the Eastern Prison Farm breakout. This was the prison that had broken him. He arranged for guns to be smuggled inside, and on that day, Raymond Hamilton, Henry Methvin, and several others escaped. During the breakout, a prison guard named Major Joe Crowson was shot. He died a few days later. This was the moment everything changed. Texas authorities were humiliated. Federal agencies got involved. And the head of the Texas prison system, Lee Simmons, made a vow. Everyone connected to that breakout would be hunted down. Over the following months and years, that vow was kept. On every single one of them ended up dead or captured, except one, Henry Methvin. Methvin avoided that fate by cutting a deal with authorities. He cooperated and helped set the trap that ended Bonnie and Clyde. To lead the hunt, Lee Simmons went looking for someone specific, a former Texas Ranger named Frank Harmer. Big, quiet, deliberate, the kind of man who was not impressed by anything or anyone. He'd been involved in more than 50 incidents in the line of duty, wounded 17 times. He came out of retirement on February 12, 1934, and he started hunting. Harmer's method, what Hamer did differently from every other officer who'd been chasing Bonnie and Clyde, was simple. He studied them instead of chasing them. He mapped their routes, analysed their patterns, and realised they moved in a big circular loop through 5 states, always crossing state lines before local jurisdictions could coordinate. He figured out that Clyde was predictable in one specific way. He kept going back to visit family, and Hamer believed the gang would eventually show up near Henry Methvin's family in northern Louisiana. He was right. What he didn't know, and what makes this even stranger, was that Clyde had already designated the Methvin family home as the emergency rallying point if the gang got separated, which is exactly what had happened. Methvin was separated from Bonnie and Clyde in Shreveport, and instead of laying low, he was helping set them up. Hamer assembled a team of 6, 4 from Texas, himself, Ted Hinton, the same Ted Hinton who used to get coffee at the diner where Bonnie waitressed, Bob Alcorn, and B.M. Galt, 2 from Louisiana, Sheriff Henderson Jordan, and Deputy Prentice Oakley. They set up along Louisiana State Highway 154 south of Gippsland on May 21st. Then they waited, all night, all through May 22nd. By the morning of May 23rd, they'd been in the brush so long they were almost ready to pack up and leave. May 23rd, 1934. At around 9:15 in the morning, they heard a car coming fast. The plan had been for Henry Methvin's father, Ivy, to park his truck alongside the road, so Clyde would slow down to talk to him. The Ford V8 slowed as it approached the truck. All 6 officers opened fire from the brush. Deputy Prentice Oakley fired first. Clyde Barrow was struck almost instantly. He died immediately. And Ted Hinton, the man who'd served Bonnie coffee years earlier, later said he heard her cry out before the barrage was over. Around 130 rounds were fired into that car. 130. Both Bonnie and Clyde had survived gunshot wounds before, but not this. There was nothing to survive here. Both of them were gone. She was 23 years old. He was 24. After it was over, the aftermath was something else entirely. More than 20,000 people showed up for Bonnie Parker's funeral on May 26th. 20,000 people. Her family couldn't even get to the graveside. Flower arrangements arrived from across the country, some with cards supposedly from Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger. Dallas newsboys sent one of the most elaborate arrangements, because the story had sold an estimated 500,000 newspapers in Dallas alone, in a single day. Bonnie had wanted to be buried next to Clyde. Her mother said no. She was first buried at Fishtrap Cemetery in Dallas, and later moved to Crown Hill Cemetery in 1945, where she still rests today. Clyde's funeral was private, held at sunset on May 25th. He's buried in Western Heights Cemetery in Dallas, right next to his brother Buck, who had died the year before. They share a granite headstone. The epitaph was chosen by Clyde himself before he died. It reads, "Gone, but not forgotten." Why we're still talking about them. Here's the part worth sitting with for a minute. Bonnie and Clyde weren't the most successful criminals of their era. They weren't the richest. They weren't even the most violent. They robbed mostly small stores and gas stations. The banks were almost a side project. The reason they became legends isn't really about what they did. It's about timing and image and those photographs. Those Joplin photos hit at exactly the right moment. The Depression was grinding everyone down. People were watching banks foreclose on their homes, watching the whole system fail ordinary people. And here were these two young kids from poor West Dallas neighborhoods, with guns and attitude and a look on their faces like they had absolutely nothing left to lose. For a lot of desperate, struggling Americans, that image landed in a very specific place. The 1967 film with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway took that image and polished it to a high shine. It's a great film. But it's almost entirely fiction in terms of character. The 2019 Netflix film The Highwayman tried to correct the balance, told the story from Frank Hamer's perspective, showed what the actual chase looked like on the law enforcement side. Worth watching. But neither one is the full truth. The full truth is messier. Two traumatized kids from poverty making terrible choices in desperate times, hurting a lot of people along the way, and burning out before they turn 25. The part nobody talks about enough. The thing that strikes me most when I go through the actual timeline is how short it really was. January 1930. Bonnie and Clyde meet. February 1932. Clyde gets out of prison. May 1934. It's over. That's basically 2 years. 2 years of this whole myth being built. In that time, at least 9 law enforcement officers died, at least 3 civilians, families who never got anyone back. Blanche Barrow survived. She wrote about all of this later from her prison cell. And what she described was a group of people who were exhausted and scared and miserable for most of it. The romance you see in the photos was real, maybe, but so was the constant fear, the cramped car, the cold streams, the infections, Bonnie's burned leg, the arguments, the running. Roy Thornton, Bonnie's husband, tried to escape from Huntsville State Prison in 1937. He died in that escape attempt. There's a kind of symmetry there that's hard to ignore. Everyone connected to this story seems to end the same way. Why this story still grips us. Here's my honest take on why Bonnie and Clyde still grip people almost 100 years later. It's not the crimes, it's the feeling the story gives you. This sense of two people who just stopped caring about the rules, got in a car, and kept driving in the middle of the Depression when the rules had failed everybody anyway. There was something that felt almost like freedom in that image, even if the reality was dirty and terrifying and ended in a hail of gunfire on a Louisiana back road. They're a Rorschach test. Depending on who you are and where you're standing, you see romantic rebels, or cold-blooded killers, or desperate victims of poverty, or just two reckless young people who made the worst possible choices. All of those things are partially true. None of them is the whole story. What I know is this. The families of the 9 officers who died during those 2 years didn't get a Hollywood ending. And Bonnie Parker's mother, Emma, wanted to bring her daughter's body home for the funeral and couldn't get close enough to the grave through the crowd. 20,000 strangers showed up to mourn a woman who had spent the last 2 years of her life in pain. Sleeping in a car, eating whatever they could find on the road. That's the real Bonnie and Clyde, not the poster, not the movie. 2 young people from nowhere who became something much bigger than themselves, and paid for it in every way you can pay. So, did any of that hit different than you expected? Drop a comment below and tell me which part genuinely surprised you. Avsart, and if you haven't subscribed to American Old West Facts yet, what are you even doing? History gets way more interesting than the textbook version when you actually look at the real stuff. See you in the next one.